Hello and welcome to Vendor Trash. Is the title a reference to my opinions, my drawing skills, or both? That's for you to decide. Before we get into things, I just need to address the fact that the past two drawings I did both prominently featured spirals. This may seem like quite the coincidence, but if you just look around in life, you'll notice that spirals are practically everywhere. And I hate them. I hate these spirals. They're nothing but a curse, and I want nothing to do with them. Thankfully, I managed to buck that trend, and in this week's drawing, there are no prominent spirals, vortexes, whirlpools, or anything of the sort. Now then, this week we're once again looking at and discussing the zones of the game, and we've now made it up to Cataclysm. And already, things are getting a bit more complicated than they were in the Burning Crusade or Wrath of the Lich King. For starters, we obviously didn't really get a new continent with all of our zones clumped together. Instead, we had them spread out across Kalimdor, Eastern Kingdoms, and basically as additional islands, which encouraged Blizzard to really increase its use of portals for player travel, something I'm not a real big fan of. But, even more troublesome was that we started to get examples of zones that you can easily make the argument shouldn't really count. After all, if it's impossible to go back to a zone once you've left it, it feels almost wrong to count it as a proper zone. Well, I'm going to go off of my own gut for such judgment calls, but I certainly couldn't fault someone for having a different list. Let's start things off with what I consider the first zone of the existing character leveling experience, Mount Hyjal. Technically, like in Wrath, it and Vashir were both options to start out with, but Hyjal simply feels far more fitting for the role. After all, by this point in the game's history, we were all kind of familiar with the zone, albeit in a limited capacity. It'd been in place since Vanilla, though blocked off with the use of terrain and an actual gate in Dark Whisper Gorge. Of course, that didn't stop more resourceful members of the community from making their way in regardless. And the zone was surprisingly well developed, complete with Nordrassil and the remains of Archimonde upon it. I believe it was intended to be a difficult max level zone, but that they simply never found a use or need for it during Vanilla. Additionally, during the Burning Crusade, we got a legitimate glimpse of the zone through the Battle for Mount Hyjal raid, which recreated the final mission of Reign of Chaos. It was one of the most unique raids we've gotten, and probably one of the most reviled, with the first 4 bosses being relative pushovers, but with 8 waves of trash apiece that would have to be repeated if you wiped at any point. The topography in both versions wound up being pretty dang close to what we got in Cataclysm, though at least the raid only really constituted the top third of the zone. So finally getting Hyjal as a bona fide zone was an interesting experience. It wasn't something completely new, but it was still exciting to see it in all of its full glory. And it is fairly glorious, especially at its summit with Nordrassil and the Well of Eternity, which has some nice particle effects going on. The northern areas of the zone are generally just pleasing to the eye with all of their greenery. It really feels like this is the peak of Night Elven culture, at least the nature side of it. Perhaps simply because the assets used here are of a higher fidelity than most of the other forests of Kalimdor. One charming feature that I always appreciated in the raid, and which still exists in the zone but is probably missed by most players flying around, is that there is a sense of vertical ascension as you move toward the World Tree, and of course, descent in the reverse direction. It's very gradual, but still palpable. I wonder if perhaps the questing experience would have worked better in reverse. At any rate, as you move toward the southern reaches of the zone, nature gives way to corruption and outright flames with the Sulfuron Spire, which offers up some stark visual contrast. I don't dislike it though. The transition is very gradual, and I really appreciate that they did connect the zone to Winterspring instead of requiring you to fly or teleport into the zone. Perhaps that's another foot race I can try one day. Travel from AQ or Andre Strauss's Cave or the Cradle of the Ancients, up through Felwood, Winterspring, and finishing at the Well of Eternity. Anyways, Hyjal is a great zone overall. Its biggest fault is probably the sheer verticality of the zone relative to, say, Ashenvale. It feels a bit artificial and is almost certainly a relic of how the world was built in Vanilla that they probably deem not worth correcting with the world revamp. I wouldn't regard it as one of my favorite zones by any means, but I have absolutely nothing else to complain about here. The other zone that players could start their journey to 85 in, or simply go to second, was Vashir. Except, not actually, because Vashir isn't an actual zone in the game. It's simply shorthand for the cluster of 3 zones located off the coast of Stormwind. We just all know what we're talking about when we say that. But I practically never hear people actually referring to the individual zones. Well, I'm going to because that's how I treat them, But first I have to touch on the general complaints people have about Vashj'ir. Many players did not care for this place due to the underwater aspects. Most significantly, having to move and fight within a three-dimensional space. Supposedly, it could be quite frustrating to some players, especially melee. Then there's the nausea and headache aspect that some players experienced. This was probably mostly due to the watery filter applied over the screen, which I believe can be disabled with a script if you're aware of it. Though I'm sure there was a subset of the group of players that still experienced some sort of discomfort by sheer virtue of being in an underwater environment and how that can mess with depth perception. And lastly, there were certainly players who just didn't psychologically enjoy the zone, be it due to thalassophobia or a general dislike of being in the ocean, something which I would have to assume got worse with each successive zone as they each got deeper and darker. This particular issue isn't really something you can toggle off either. And due to all of the complaints levied at the zones, Blizz seems to have steered clear of ever giving us a fully underwater zone again. Not even Nazjatar, which instead opted to simply pull all of the water back. Now, personally, I never seemed to suffer from any of those issues and actually found that the Vashj'ir experience was really dang cool. Unique, certainly, but not in a way that felt foreign from the rest of the game. I guess I'm blessed in that regard because I find that these zones have so much to offer, and it'd be a darn shame to not be able to appreciate them. Now, getting down to the individual zones, we first had Kelpthar Forest. This was the smallest of the three, due in part to not initially having access to the Vashj'ir Seahorse used to quickly traverse the zone, though it doesn't take too long before you unlock that. And heck, if you're a druid, then you have Aquatic Form, which was both instant cast and faster. It was a swell time. As its name implies, the zone is most characterized by the heavy presence of kelp, and it generally functions as the just below the surface section of Vashj'ir. As such, it has the brightest natural lighting. There is a fair bit of color to the zone, though the predominant ones are certainly the white sand and green kelp. The introduction to the zone is certainly bombastic, having your ship sunk by a kraken and needing to venture out from the upside down hull. And the shipwreck element continues on, as this place is absolutely littered with them. Aside from that, there isn't a ton to the zone due to its meager size. There's Naga, Gilblins, Murlocs, sea giants, and some wildlife like sharks. So while it's not the largest of zones, even compared to vanilla zones, it does have a lot of character and heart. I'd simply have given it a bit more space to breathe. Heading south brings us to the Shimmering Expanse, which is significantly larger, though still smaller than most zones. We're far deeper beneath the waves now, and the lighting is slightly darker to reflect that. Of the three Vashj'ir zones, this is probably the one with the greatest biodiversity, with a wide range of kelp, corals, anemones, and other wildlife, easily the most colorful we get, which also makes the quest hub caves feel all the more fitting. You quickly learn that these are all marked with the purple anemone things with a few yellow ones sticking out from them. You see one of these spots, you know you can probably swim inside and rest easy. Both this zone and the Abyssal Depths feature the whale sharks that calmly patrol some of the higher up layers. Though not as memorable as Fellreavers, these do have the advantage of being both quiet and being an underwater threat, which tends to make everything scarier. There are two really big features of this zone that stand out above the rest. The first are the ruins of Vashj'ir, the grand night elven city once ruled over by Lady Vash's mother, Lestharia Vash, for whom the region was named. Of course, the ruins are fully submerged now, and, unsurprisingly, populated by the Naga. The ruins are very vertical, and that honestly makes them one of the most frustrating parts of the zone, as it can be quite confusing where exactly you need to go for certain quests. The other major landmark is Nespira, one of the Nautilus-like demigods of the area that has basically become part of the geography, and whom is so large that you can crawl inside of her and even see her heart and brain. The zone is beautiful, fun to move around and quest in, and probably the default image one would think of when they think of Vashj'ir as a whole. Tons to love here if you don't mind the usual underwater complaints. I should also mention that this is the zone where, if you travel to the surface, you'll encounter the Sandy Beach, a very cool looking atoll that pretty much exists as just a point in Vashj'ir that they could stick an above the water flight master on so you can taxi here. I really like it. Completing the trio of underwater zones, we have the Abyssal Depths. We're going even deeper now, and deeper means darker. The default atmospheric colors here are dark blue and purple, and most of the flora and coral here are colored to match. we encounter another demigod here, Lagoric, who dies mid-quest as a result of the Twilight's hammer draining him for their rituals. Yeah, things are darker here than in Shimmering Expanse. Lagoric isn't the only dead thing here, as south of him we have the haunting Abandoned Reef. This area is super cool and super unsettling. Pretty much the only thing in this subzone are some crabs and the rare spawn ghost crawler spirit beast that you can tame. I actually managed to get this guy on my hunter while checking for Poseidus quite a while back. And of course, the largest feature of the zone is the Abyssal Breach, a wide underwater valley with a whirlpool at the center that will suck you down a large vertical shaft into the pretty cool hub area where the entrance to the Throne of the Tides is located, and where the entrance to the Abyssal Maw dungeon/raid was going to be located. I do think it's a darn shame that never happened. I believe it was planned to be 4 bosses and was cut due to a lack of resources and general distaste for the underwater experience. For that matter, I think it's a darn shame that we haven't gotten a single additional underwater zone. I get that they're not everyone's cup of tea, but that could be said of any biome. Alas, the whole zone feels designed to trigger thalassophobia and similar deep sea horror vibes. A dark atmosphere, massive vacuous space, ominous music, and of course the finale quests, which feature both Nazgrim shouting "Thralls, balls!" and a nerve-wracking battle where you ride inside a submarine. This will either be the Pincer X2 for the Alliance or the Verne for the Horde, obviously named for Jules Verne, who wrote 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Nothing quite like being so far underwater that the light is barely able to reach you, stuck inside a tin can, with an intense battle going on just outside. And you have to witness your greatest ally in this battle, Neptulon, the elemental lord of water, being subdued by the giant kraken Ozumat. It puts me right in that tantalizing uneasy zone, and I adore it for that. I can completely understand why most players wouldn't care for the zone or simply find it gloomy as heck, but in my eyes, it embraces an atmosphere that no other zone really goes for. It feels borderline Lovecraftian in that regard, and is the closest thing we ever got to what I wish Ny'alotha had ultimately been. Oh, speaking of old god stuff, off the edge of the zone, deep into Fatigue Waters, there are these big skeletons of some deep sea creatures, as well as a massive pearl. It's the kind of thing that's difficult to even notice and even harder to physically get to, though I believe some players have. This spot, and the depths of the ocean in general, were often the topic of secret hunt theory crafting. It's mysterious stuff deep in the ocean. There must be something deeper that we're not seeing. The fish know all the secrets. They know the cold. They know the dark. To find them, drown yourself in the circle of stars. This zone is awesome. I simply wish, like with the other Vashj'ir zones, that we'd gotten more of it. Our next zone is Deepholm, the elemental plane of Earth. And personally, it always kind of bugged me how differently the 4 elemental planes got implemented in the game. Deepholm is a zone, Skywall was added as a dungeon and raid, the Abyssal Maw was meant to either be 2 dungeons or a dungeon plus a raid, plus a little hub area below Vashj'ir, but the raid got cut, so it's basically just the Throne of the Tides. And the Firelands was a raid, the Molten Front Zone, and a few disparate subzones accessed from around Hyjal through Flame Gates. I know expecting parity between the 4 is a bit silly, but it messes with my colloquial OCD, dang it. Also of note was that the point that Deathwing would emerge from, and thus the point that we would enter the zone from, was originally not planned to be the Maelstrom, but instead an area between Elwyn Forest, Dunmoreau, Syrian Gorge, and the Burning Steppes called Deathwing Scar. That area simply got converted into ocean, but there are still remnants from this decision in the game, as there is literally now a giant chasm south of Dunmoreau that would have sprung out of this area. And in fact, in the Cata cinematic, it very much looked like this general region is where he burst back into Azeroth. Personally, I think this idea was much better, as it would have helped flesh out that area of the world a bit, made Deepholm feel less isolated, and would have felt less over the top than tying the Maelstrom into it all as well. That was a lot of blabbering, and I still haven't started talking about Deepholm itself. And simply put, it's a very well made zone. The layout is admittedly a bit basic, big circle with a giant structure in the middle, but it works here, considering the world pillar, housed within the Temple of Earth, is what's basically bearing the weight of the elemental plane. If it hadn't been repaired, Deepholm would have collapsed into Azeroth, which, hey, that'd have been a great way to integrate it into the Eastern Kingdoms, just saying. But yes, thematically, it makes a lot of sense for it to be in the heart of the zone. and the temple was even slated at one point to serve as the main hub of the expansion, before that got changed to simply being Orgrimmar and Stormwind. East of the temple, you have the location where Deathwing fell into Deepholm in recent years. Not where Deathwing was fitted with his adamantite/elementium plates, even though it looks very similar to the Cata cinematic. That actually occurred within the stone core. And to the north, we've got the Crumbling Depths, a very cool sinkhole looking area that is the deepest part of Deepholm, until they added the dark fissure to the depths that takes you even deeper still. The outer shelf of the zone does a solid job of creating visually distinct subzones, such as the Crimson Expanse, Silver Marsh, and the Pale Roost. And of course, on the northern edge of the zone, you have Therazane's Throne, where the Elemental Lord dwells. It's a bit of a visual cacophony of different colored ores and gems, and has this cool effect where from the outside, it looks like rays of light are radiating out of it. And, story time, while leveling my priest up here way back in the day, I happened to notice Aeonax, and this was before mount collecting was even a thing I cared about. Even so, I jumped on top of him while at basically 0 mana and took an absolute eternity killing the guy. It was very stressful, but ultimately made it all the more satisfying when I managed to fell the creature. It made it feel like a genuine battle between us. And I got extra stressed because I was reading general chat at the same time, where some players were groaning over missing their shot, especially when I was taking so dang long to kill it. I'm pretty sure I was wanding a good deal to make it through that. Remember when we used wands to auto-attack? Crazy to look back on. Anyway, it's a very well made zone all in all, with my only real gripe being how disconnected it is from the rest of the game. Not really one of my favorites, but again, nothing much to complain about. Our next destination brings us to the southern tip of Kalimdor, where we find ancient Egypt. I mean, not really, but pretty much. Seriously, was this what anyone was expecting to be behind the ruins of Oldham from vanilla? It certainly wasn't what was in my mind's eye, probably because I assumed it'd be a lot more like Ulduar. You know, a facility. And it really is Egypt the zone. You've got massive expanses of sand and dunes. You've got pyramids. You've got giant statues of cat creatures. You've got a massively important river that sustains the life and civilization within the zone. You've even got a subzone with Cradle in the name. And I'm a big fan of Egyptology. I mean, original Yu-Gi-Oh! Was absolutely my jam. So you would think I'd be a massive fan of this zone. And to be fair, back in the day, it probably was my favorite Cataclysm zone. But there's something about the place that makes it a bit of a hard sell to me. I think the most prominent problem is I just don't care about the zone's indigenous population, the Tol'vir. Okay, they're cat centaurs, and I don't know, their culture doesn't feel very well explored. The only one whose name I remember is King Ferris, since you know that's pretty much just King Pharaoh. Granted, I haven't properly quested in the zone in many years, but I don't think the lack of memorability is entirely on me. Another major problem for me is that there are, funnily enough, too many ancient ruins and tombs and structures and pyramids and obelisks to explore. Like, there are just oodles of them, and that makes the significance of any individual one quickly become difficult to recognize. While I think the overall quantity should have been scaled back, I think a partial fix could have been to associate certain landmarks with the 4 Titan Watchers that you face at the top of the Halls of Origination, who were criminally underutilized. Speaking of the Halls of Origination, they house the Forge of Origination, which is basically a titanic superweapon that can re-originate all of Azeroth. Maybe that's something we should invest a lot more security into monitoring. Another particularly memorable bit from the east side of the zone was the Gnome Obliteration quest that was basically Katamari Damacy, but with gnome victims. Something that they turned into a daily quest because they knew players would want to re-experience it. The center of the zone is the most verdant, thanks to the Vernal River. I always love the inside of the dam in particular. The western side of the zone leans far more into the desert vibe, with signs of civilization being far more scarce, which I appreciated. And floating far above the zone, we had the entrances to the Vortex Pinnacle and the Throne of the Four Winds, which sort of feels randomly thrown in. But if you had to put entrances to Skywall somewhere on Azeroth, this place does make a lot of sense. It's a windswept desert, and air elementals seem to have a lot of Arabic design influences. Although it didn't bug me as much at the time, a common complaint of the zone was that way too much of the story was dedicated to a long Indiana Jones parody, and nowadays, I have to agree. It was nominally amusing, but it really came at the cost of fleshing out the native culture of the zone, which was clearly needed. It's extremely speculative, but there was a data-mined prop of a female Tauren made in what appears to be the style of Uldum statues that wasn't actually utilized until the Incognito puzzle rooms. Conceivably, this might have meant more Tauren lore, especially for the Sunwalkers, which frankly feel extremely undercooked. I also feel like revisiting the zone in BFA did the place no favors. Nobody wants to spend time in a desert zone when you can't actually enjoy the sun and bright colors. So, in sum, the zone has a lot of great things going for it, honestly being a gorgeous zone, but is held back by too much emphasis on mysterious ancient structures while simultaneously underdeveloping its stories and cultures. The last of our core max-level zones was the Twilight Highlands, and unfortunately, I have relatively little to actually say about it by sheer virtue of it being the one I had the least experience with. It was naturally the one I was least likely to experience while leveling alts, especially to completion, which is a real shame in retrospect because there is a lot going on here. Ever since vanilla, we were taunted with the presence of Grim Batol and how it was going to actually be implemented. Of course, related to this, we have a heavy red Dragonflight presence centered around the Vermilion Redoubt, and naturally tied to Grim Batol, we have both of the factions present in the zone, the Wildhammer Dwarves for the Alliance and the Dragonmaw Orcs for the Horde. The significance of all of this was certainly lost on me back in the day. After all, Grim Batol used to serve as a major city for the Wildhammers before Mogdud Thorsan brought a curse upon it, and most of them relocated to Airy Peak. And of course, the Dragonmaw occupied the city during the Second War, where they also subjugated much of the Red Dragonflight. This is all a lot of very interesting history that just didn't do much for me at the time. The Wildhammers were also interesting as their settlements in the zone look extremely styled after hobbit holes. We also had a bunch of other interesting subzones to enjoy here. There was the Maw of Madness to the north, which felt like a big deal until they stuffed two very similar things into the Dragon Soul raid. We had the Krasworks, which to this day is still an incredibly unique and cool settlement, being a town in a box accidentally deployed on top of a narrow mountain, so they had to make do with lots of walkways and Zeppelin usage. We had the third, sort of fourth round of Circle of Blood quests, this time the Crucible of Carnage. We had the whole burnt out obsidian forest that was once a red dragon hub before the black dragons incinerated it, and we had the whole area leading up to the Bastion of Twilight, which, how does that structure even really work? Don't get me wrong, it's a cool landmark, but even with magic it seems absurdly difficult to build, and even less practical to utilize. Well, whatever. It's cool, and that's all we really care about. I have to say that back during Cata, I found the zone kind of visually boring, but I was stupid and wrong. I mean, it's not remotely close to being my favorite zone, but I absolutely respect and admire its design. It feels like a very natural extension to its neighbor zone of the wetlands, and frankly, it having a more muted, down-to-earth design is something I can really appreciate. Not every zone needs to be this crazy spectacle location, and it'd honestly be boring if they were. I say while kind of ignoring the humongous Maw creature and the humongous Twilight Tower. So, good on you, Twilight Highlands. You're not too bad. And now we move on to the Goblin and Worgen starting zones, which all suffer from the problem of being criminally underused. Particularly the Goblin ones, which you cannot revisit in any capacity, which also makes it harder for me to accurately evaluate them, as I only did them once or twice, long ago, and I don't particularly want to replay them just to refamiliarize myself with the geography. Let's begin by looking at Kazan, which constituted the first half of the Goblin questing. Kazan is kind of an industrial poop hole of an island, that in many ways completely amplified the concept of goblins we had before Cataclysm. And I love it, this place looks awesome. Not to actually visit in real life or anything, I can feel the carcinogens just by looking at the screenshots, but the place absolutely nails an image that few other places in the game strive for. Heck, look at those massive factories. I know they're probably cardboard cutouts, but how cool does a dungeon or raid set in there sound? The environment is a fascinating blend of the natural island, albeit poisoned to heck and back with pollution, and the grungy metal buildings and roadways of the goblins. And those roadways really are just the best. I love that they're essentially a series of metal plates that the goblins will quite comfortably elevate to get around pre-existing objects with no regard for barriers of any sort. It's a shame we didn't get any of those in Undermine. I love all of the goblin doodads laying around everywhere. The dirty lights, the oil drums, the tacky signs. I love that everything is so shoddily made, from the roads to the football fields to the pipes that are supposed to keep the dangerous chemicals away from us. It includes one of the most entertaining quest chains of any starting zone to boot. I would have happily had it be the entire Goblin starting experience, but unfortunately Deathwing makes Mount Kanjaro explode and we need to get out of town, never to truly return. Now, this was on the northern coast, and we do come back to the southern side of the island for the Motherlode dungeon in BFA, which was appreciated. The two do feel kind of different, most notably in the skybox, but we can just assume that the dungeon takes place at night. And we also technically visit the island again in the War Within via Undermine, which is, well, located under the rest of the island. Sadly, the surface of the island isn't connected in any way, and I fear it probably never will be. It doesn't feel like the kind of thing that Blizzard will ever deem worth the resources just to satisfy the niche of players like myself who would really appreciate it. Which is a shame, but oh well. So an absolutely stellar zone whose only failings were being too small and being somewhere we can never go back to. After we escape the destruction of Kazan on Gallywix's boat, we are sunk by an attack from the Alliance and wash up on the Lost Isles. It's all very unique in that it's the only starting experience that's divided into two separate zones. And frankly, both of them were enjoyable enough that they could have stood on their own. The Lost Isles are absolutely gorgeous, especially the beach sections, but the jungle as well. You start out on a relatively small piece of land before traversing the strait between it and the main island, where you promptly set up a town in a box. Throughout the experience, we work alongside Thrall and his main squeeze, Agra, and face off against the Alliance, Gallywix's forces, pygmies, and Naga inhabiting the highborn ruins of Vashalan. Although the beach is probably the most aesthetic element to the zone, so much so that it was used for the Goblin character screen background, my favorite part is probably the caldera and the escarpment leading up to it, because they feel like a surprisingly unique geographical element for WoW zones. Volcanoes in this game usually aren't dormant, but as a result, we've got a very scenic and green slope leading up to the entrance, and, well, a caldera that you can run around and quest in since it's not submerged in liquid hot magma. Of course, this is a Goblin starter experience, so we naturally kill a fire turtle that causes the whole thing to explode and put a real seared blanket on the whole serenity of the zone. We then beat up Gallywix, and Thrall basically forces him to join the Horde as our leader. A controversial decision at the time, and even to this day, but it did give us one of the most entertaining racial leaders for a period, so I don't hate it. Anyway, funny as it may be to have two volcanoes erupt on us in the span of just a few levels, I really don't think it was necessary. But I guess since they weren't planning on letting us come back, which is the real tragedy of these zones, Blizz figured they may as well go full Scorched Earth. Still, they cannot scorch my memories of this lovely set of islands. Worgens, on the other hand, had their entire starting experience in one zone, Gilneas, which was also actually attached to the mainland. As such, it's still completely possible to visit the zone. Sort of. Technically, the version of Gilneas you level up in is different from the open world version, which is called the Ruins of Gilneas, which is used primarily for Horde quests in Silverpine Forest, and has most of its NPCs and functionality stripped out of it. At least until the horribly underwhelming reclamation of Gilneas quests in Dragonflight, which restored a few of its NPCs and functionality. Quite the letdown after being a lingering plot thread for so long, and really, Gilneas City should have been made to function as an actual capital. Anyway, I'm treating the two versions of Gilneas as one because lore-wise, they are. The zone is, surprise surprise, absolutely beautiful. Gloomy as heck, no doubt, but that just adds to its charm. We want something that looks like it'd instill persistent depressive disorder into its citizens. But no, really, Victorian werewolves were begging for this aesthetic. It's by no means a one-trick pony though, as there are plenty of landmarks to keep things interesting. Obviously, the northern border features the iconic Greymane Wall, now partially devastated by the earthquake Deathwing caused. You've got gloomy woods, you've got the comparatively flat headlands, which are decorated with old Gilnean stone ruins that feel reminiscent of old England ruins. You've got the Galewatch Lighthouse, which was actually fun to climb to. There's Greymane Manor, which is both impressive and unique in its design. And clearly I'm not the only one who noticed, because Dragonflight added an NPC that will clear out the few NPCs that are there if you want to use it for RP purposes. You've got that one village that got swallowed into the sea. You've got the Blackwald, which, as its name implies, is literally a black forest where druids of the Scythe resided back in the day. And let's not forget Gilneas City itself, which is a fantastically developed settlement. Really, why were Worgen and goblins never given proper functioning capitals? And lastly, helping to tie all of these individual elements together are some very cool bridges and pathways leading up into the mountains. Gilneas was fun to traverse on foot, and I wish more zones continued to be made with that mindset. So a wonderful zone whose only flaw was being abandoned by Blizzard. The Maelstrom was a zone of major significance not only to Cataclysm, but to WoW's story as a whole. It was originally the location where Y'Shaarj had taken root before being ripped out by Aman'Thul. The area was later treated and fortified by the Titan Keepers, in the process becoming a great font of arcane energies. This caused the Dark Trolls who happened to settle near it to evolve into Night Elves, who erected their capital, Elundris, on its shores. This city would later be renamed to Zin Ajari. Ajara and her highborn researched the well and ultimately used it to help usher the Burning Legion into Azeroth, hoping to bring Sargeras himself through. This never came to pass as the Night Elf Rebellion wound up blowing up the Well of Eternity, resulting in the Sundering that split the great continent of Kalimdor apart. And at the center of the now disparate lands was a great whirlpool that would never stop churning. The Maelstrom, which is also where Deathwing emerged from and would, at the end of the expansion, crash back into for our final fight, which feels like it was trying way too hard, but that's not super relevant here. So clearly an extremely important location in the lore, and one that just sounds like it should be insanely cool. And it is. Perhaps because they didn't put anything else into it, they were able to focus entirely on maximizing the atmosphere of this place. Heck, the water isn't even swimmable, so we've just got the whirlpool itself, a few surrounding platforms, and the skybox, and they make all of it look absolutely phenomenal. Heck, aside from the intro quests for Deepholm, I don't think they even use the place again until the Madness of Deathwing. Though I'm probably forgetting some bit, maybe the Thrall quests. I don't even know if it was possible to go back otherwise, until it was reutilized in Legion for the Shaman class hall. I guess they just recognized that they needed to make this place epic, and they did. Well, once they added Epicus Maximus, the guitarist Forsaken riding a devil sword riding a shark mounted with 2 rockets and a laser in response to complaints that the zone was not epic enough already. Unfortunately, he was removed for the live game, but he did return as a Brawlers Guild encounter. All in all, the Maelstrom achieves what it sets out to do spectacularly well, even if it is completely non-functional as a normal gameplay zone, which makes it very hard to have a balanced opinion on it, but I think I've gotten my point across. Let's move on to Tol Barad, which is really quite fascinating to me for several reasons. First of all, despite being quite close geographically to Gilneas, it's on its own world server, which, given how they managed to put Vashj'ir in the Eastern Kingdoms, is probably due entirely to its PvP aspects. Secondly, it was split into 2 zones again, presumably to keep the PvP area separate from the daily area. And thirdly, just the PvP area itself. Clearly, Blizz saw the popularity of Wintergrasp and wanted to replicate it. I wasn't very active at all during Cata, but the impression I get is that it failed to really do so. But before I go further, I'm going to try to hone in and tackle them one at a time because they are different zones. First, just because it's what you poured into from Orgrimmar and Stormwind, or through a mage portal because apparently it was really important that we mages got that, let's talk about Tol Barad Peninsula. It's pretty much just a daily hub where you grind out 1 reputation. The total area is really quite small. Other than the faction camps, there are 7 areas, but each of those areas is nothing much at all. Basically room for like 3 daily quests to fit, and not really offering anything super unique. The area doesn't look bad. In fact, it's kind of cool, especially with the rusty metal bridges. But given how little it does, it winds up feeling like a less compelling Gilneas. Perhaps the most interesting aspect to it is actually the large bridge on its southern hill that leads to Tol Barad, the actual PvP area. I'll be honest, despite having grinded out both of the mounts on the peninsula, I'd only visited this zone like once to see the raid, and so had to refresh myself to write the script. Again, the general vibe here isn't bad. Gloomy prison island, rusty metal, cool. But what else? From what I gather, the objective is to control the 3 nearly identical establishments by having more players at them and nudging the ownership bar, and if you win, you get to control Baird and Hold. I have no idea what the spires are for though, and there are 3 underground cell blocks, one of which will be open at a time. There's just really not much to it. Perhaps it's because of my personal interests and preferences, but I think what would have been way cooler is to remove the PvP stuff entirely, combine the two zones into one because they use identical tile sets, and make it into a regular questing zone. Heck, even if it's just for low levels, wouldn't that be cool? You're gonna fly out to this prison island and help clean things up for a few levels before heading back to the mainland? Well, at any rate, the two zones are fine. They look mildly cool, wasted potential for sure, and they certainly don't justify being two zones. But hey, isn't some criticism refreshing? Next up, we have the Molten Front, and I'll be honest, I had to train myself over the years to remember that this is a zone that exists. Which is funny because I never had to do that with Hrothgar's Landing, which has way less going for it. I think it's simply because you port into it from Highjaw, so I kind of just thought of it as a Highjaw daily hub, but no, it's an actual zone in its own right. The third zone of the game to be added in a patch. And I'll be honest again, when running around to refresh my memory of the zone, I feel like there were areas I'd seldom if ever visited back when I did the rep grind long ago. Anyway, the area is certainly visually distinct from every other outdoor zone out there, being literally in the Firelands. There's an okayish diversity of subzones, not a ton, and they aren't that different from one another, but I recognize it's hard to come up with a lot of sub-biomes for the elemental plane of fire. I did appreciate the rock platforms that are constantly melting away and reforming, forcing you to be slightly strategic to navigate them if you don't want to fall to your death. And I think it's really cool that you can see the actual landmass of the Firelands raid to the east of the zone. My criticisms of the zone are simple. It's on its own world server, which I'm never fond of. It's ultimately pretty small, and despite being a unique outdoor zone, it has zero visual distinction from the Firelands raid. I'm probably being a bit harsh, but those are just things that affect my appreciation of a zone. Not bad, but definitely not one of my favorites. And this was a close one because I scripted out the rest of this episode and actually went a solid month or two before remembering that, oh yeah, Dark Moon Island is a place that exists and was added in Cataclysm. That's not to say it's forgettable due to its quality, simply due to its nature of being sort of an evergreen area not located on any of the main continents. It does occur to me that yes, this is yet another catazone that can accurately be described as a dark forest, but honestly, it works. Not as well as Gilneas, but still pretty dang good. And of course, the forest itself is largely to set the mood for the fair itself. And let me just say that they really did nail the mood. Prior to this, it was just a dinky little ring set up in Mulgore, Elwyn Forest, and Herikar Forest, and seemed to be aiming for a Renaissance fair design, which is fine enough, but kind of redundant when you're already in a vaguely medieval fantasy world. There really wasn't a lot to do either. What they leaned into with Cataclysm and the new island feels far more compelling, a full-blown carnival, a spooky one at that. The playful yet almost somber music adds to the atmosphere even further. Confining the fair proper to such a small portion of the island was also clever on Blizzard's end because it gave them a lot of room to expand, which they have to an extent, but there's clearly far more they can do with the place in the future. One thing I've always liked was the idea of a dungeon or raid located on the island, though I suppose the limited accessibility would get frustrating. It's not as though there's a shortage of things to do if you're interested though. Sure, nowadays I mostly just use it for some easy profession skill points every month and to grab the 10% rep buff, but there were times where I did far more to earn mounts and whatnot. All in all, an excellent zone that knows what kind of a feel it's aiming for and hits the mark pretty dang well. And those are the zones of Cataclysm. Honestly, I had a real hard time picking my favorite because with just a few exceptions, all of the zones were very enjoyable in their own rights. Perhaps that was a benefit of them not making a new continent, but instead filling in the gaps from vanilla and adding a few isolated curveballs at us. It allowed them to really stand out, and for any weak points to be less noticeable. I still absolutely, completely, wholeheartedly prefer when every zone gets put into one cohesive continent, but I can at least recognize the upsides of this approach. And in Cataclysm's case, I think that definitely keeps people from remembering it as fondly. Cata was defined just as much by how it revamped all of the vanilla zones, and those changes were, to many, on average, a slight downgrade. Regardless, there was still a lot to appreciate here. But let's get back to a proper continent next time. For this week's drawing, I went with my favorite Cataclysm zone, the Abyssal Depths. And yeah, as you probably noticed, I started out trying to draw the Abandoned Reef just because it felt like a very unique and almost cinematic subzone, but it really didn't feel representative of the zone as a whole, so I switched to the Abyssal Breach. And I still struggled quite a bit with getting the lighting and atmosphere correct, and with the whirlpool itself. But I am decently satisfied with how it turned out. It was fun putting in the shadows of the sea animals and the lighting from the Vern. And I know I said otherwise at the beginning, but I've really come around on spirals. There's a certain comfort in how they draw you into their center, how they are the very embodiment of infinity, of inevitability. Really, spirals are a blessing if you think about it. Yeah. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next week. Bye-bye.